Hello, how are you today? And are you ready to hear mysteries? If you're ready, I'll tell you.
The Cursed Ruins of Con Sun Island. Con Sun Island, a small, isolated island off the southern coast of Vietnam, is known for its pristine beaches and lush tropical forests. But beyond its natural beauty lies a dark history that few dare to speak of. The island was once home to a notorious prison during the Vietnam War, where countless soldiers and political prisoners were held, tortured, and killed. The prison, now in ruins, stands as a silent witness to the atrocities that took place within its walls. Lieutenant Michael Carter, a seasoned officer with a keen interest in history, was part of a team sent to document and preserve the historical sites on Con Sun Island. Accompanying him were Sergeant Lisa Tran, Corporal Nguyen Min, and Private Emily Walker. They arrived on the island on a warm, sunny morning, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. Their guide, an elderly local named Mr. Bao, met them at the dock. He was a frail man with a somber expression, his eyes filled with the weight of memories long buried. "You must be careful," he warned them in a hushed tone. "The spirits here are restless. They do not take kindly to intruders." The team brushed off his warnings, attributing them to superstitious beliefs. They set up camp near the ruins of the old prison and began their work, documenting the decaying structures and cataloging artifacts left behind by the prisoners. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the island, a sense of unease settled over the camp. That night, as the team gathered around the campfire, Mr. Bao shared the grim history of the prison. He spoke of the brutal treatment of prisoners, the inhumane conditions, and the many lives lost to disease, starvation, and torture. "The souls of the dead linger here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They seek vengeance for the suffering they endured." Lieutenant Carter listened intently, but remained skeptical. "We're here to document history, not chase ghosts," he said firmly. "Let's get some rest. We have a lot of work to do tomorrow." As the team settled into their tents, the jungle around them seemed to come alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. But amid the natural chorus, there was an undercurrent of something unnatural, a faint whispering that seemed to emanate from the ruins. Emily, unable to sleep, decided to take a walk around the camp. As she approached the prison's entrance, she felt a sudden chill, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. She turned to head back, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The whispering grew louder, and she could make out the faint cries of anguish and despair. She saw shadowy figures flitting between the trees, their forms barely discernible in the moonlight. Panic set in, and she ran back to the camp, breathless and trembling. "Emily, what's wrong?" Lisa asked, noticing her distress. "I saw something," Emily stammered. "Shadows, voices, it felt like they were all around me." Lieutenant Carter frowned. "Stay close to the camp. We can't afford to have anyone wandering off alone." The next day, the team resumed their work, but the atmosphere was tense. They couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As they explored deeper into the ruins, they found evidence of makeshift shrines, offerings of food, candles, and incense left by the locals to appease the spirits. Nguyen, who had grown up hearing stories of the island's hauntings, felt a growing sense of dread. In one of the prison cells, they discovered a hidden chamber. The walls were covered in cryptic symbols and eerie paintings depicting scenes of torment and suffering. At the center of the chamber was an ancient, rusted iron cage, large enough to hold a person. The air inside was thick with a nauseating stench, and the temperature was unnaturally cold. "We need to document this," Carter said, snapping photographs. But as he did, the whispers began again, louder and more insistent. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the air grew thick with malevolence. Suddenly, the door to the chamber slammed shut, trapping them inside. The team members' flashlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Panic ensued as they fumbled to find an escape. Nguyen felt a cold hand grasp his shoulder, and he screamed, the sound echoing through the chamber. The whispers turned into anguished wails, and ghostly figures began to materialize around them, prisoners in tattered uniforms, their faces contorted in agony. The spirits reached out, their eyes filled with a haunting plea for justice. Lisa, her voice shaking, began to recite a Buddhist prayer her grandmother had taught her. The spirits paused, their wails softening, but the sense of danger remained. They needed to find a way out before the spirits' anger turned deadly. Using the faint glow of a lighter, Carter found a hidden lever on the wall. He pulled it, and the door creaked open. The team rushed out, gasping for fresh air. They stumbled back to their camp, where Mr. Bao awaited them, his expression grave. "You have disturbed them," he said. "The spirits of this place are not at peace. You must leave offerings and perform a ritual to appease them." Desperate to end the nightmare, the team followed Mr. Bao's instructions. They gathered food, incense, and candles, setting up an altar at the entrance to the prison. Mr. Bao led them in a traditional Vietnamese ritual, chanting prayers and burning offerings. The air grew still, and a sense of calm slowly settled over the island. The next morning, as they prepared to leave, they noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The jungle seemed less oppressive, and the ruins less foreboding. The spirits, it seemed, had been placated for now. As they boarded the boat to return to the mainland, Lieutenant Carter looked back at the island. He could feel the weight of its history, the suffering and sorrow etched into every stone. He knew they had only scratched the surface of the island's mysteries, and that the ghosts of Khan Sun would continue to haunt those who dared to disturb their rest. The team returned to their base, their experience on Khan Sun Island leaving an indelible mark on their souls. They shared their story with their superiors, ensuring that the history of the island would be preserved and remembered. And though they had escaped with their lives, they knew that the ghosts of Khan Sun would forever linger in their memories, a chilling reminder of the horrors of the past. The Ghosts of Hue, a haunting in Vietnam. In the dense, mist-laden jungles near Hue, Vietnam, lies an abandoned military base known as Camp Echo. The base, once bustling with activity during the Vietnam War, now stands in eerie silence, overgrown with vines and reclaimed by nature. Stories of the supernatural have circulated among the locals for decades, warning of restless spirits and ghostly apparitions. Captain David Harris had heard the stories but paid them little mind. As a member of an international peacekeeping force, his duty was to assess the structural integrity of the old base and determine if it could be repurposed for humanitarian aid. Alongside him were Lieutenant Rachel Adams, Corporal Thomas Nguyen, and Sergeant Lucas Martinez. They arrived at the edge of the jungle on a humid afternoon, the air thick with anticipation and an unshakable sense of foreboding. As they made their way through the jungle, the path became increasingly treacherous. The thick underbrush and towering trees created a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. After several hours of trudging through the dense foliage, they finally reached the gates of Camp Echo. The rusted gates creaked open, revealing a sprawling complex of decaying buildings and empty watchtowers. "Welcome to the land of ghosts," Corporal Nguyen muttered, his voice tinged with unease. His family had lived in Vietnam for generations, and he had grown up hearing tales of the haunted camp. Captain Harris dismissed the comment with a wave. "Let's focus on the task at hand. We need to survey the area before nightfall." They split into pairs, with Captain Harris and Lieutenant Adams heading toward the main barracks while Nguyen and Martinez inspected the mess hall and administrative buildings. As they walked through the dilapidated corridors, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Shadows seemed to flit at the edge of their vision, and the faint sound of whispering filled the air. In the main barracks, Harris and Adams found old photographs and personal belongings scattered across the floor. The atmosphere was thick with a palpable sense of loss and abandonment. As Adams picked up a tattered photograph of a young soldier, she felt a cold hand brush against her shoulder. She turned around, but no one was there. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Harris nodded, his expression grim. "We need to hurry. This place is getting to me." Meanwhile, Nguyen and Martinez explored the mess hall, where the faint smell of decayed food lingered. They found a journal belonging to a soldier named Tran Van Min. The entry spoke of strange occurrences, phantom footsteps, objects moving on their own, and a pervasive sense of dread that enveloped the camp. As night fell, the team regrouped in the central courtyard. The jungle around them seemed to come alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. An unnatural chill settled over the camp, and a dense fog rolled in, obscuring their vision. Suddenly, they heard a distant wailing, a mournful cry that echoed through the trees. The sound grew closer, more distinct, until it seemed to emanate from within the camp itself. The team exchanged worried glances, their bravado waning. "We need to leave," Nguyen said urgently. "Now." But before they could move, ghostly figures began to materialize around them. They were soldiers, their uniforms tattered and stained with blood. Their faces were twisted in agony, eyes hollow and unseeing. The apparitions reached out with skeletal hands, their voices a cacophony of despair. "Why have you disturbed our rest?" One of the ghosts, a young Vietnamese soldier, demanded, His voice was filled with sorrow and anger. "We mean no harm," Captain Harris replied, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We're here to assess the base for humanitarian purposes." The ghost's expression softened slightly. "We were forgotten, left to die in this cursed place. Our spirits cannot find peace." Lieutenant Adams stepped forward, her eyes filled with compassion. "We will ensure your story is told. You will not be forgotten." The ghosts began to recede, their forms dissolving into the mist. But the air remained heavy with a sense of unfinished business. The team knew they had to uncover the full story behind the haunting to truly honor the fallen soldiers. They spent the next few days delving into the history of Camp Echo, piecing together the tragic events that had led to the hauntings. They learned that during the war, the camp had been the site of a brutal massacre. The soldiers, both American and Vietnamese, had been caught in a surprise attack and slaughtered without mercy. Their bodies were left to rot, and their spirits, filled with anger and sorrow, had remained bound to the camp. Determined to bring closure to the restless spirits, the team organized a memorial service. They gathered in the central courtyard, where they read out the names of the fallen soldiers and honored their memories. As they did so, a sense of calm began to settle over the camp. The fog lifted, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lighten. That night, as they prepared to leave, the team saw the ghosts one final time. But this time, the apparitions were different. They stood tall and proud, their expressions peaceful. The young Vietnamese soldier who had spoken to them earlier stepped forward, a faint smile on his lips. "Thank you," he said simply, before fading away into the night. As the team made their way back through the jungle, they felt a sense of accomplishment and relief. They had not only fulfilled their mission, but had also brought peace to the spirits of Camp Echo. The experience had changed them, leaving an indelible mark on their souls. From that day forward, they carried the story of the haunted camp with them, ensuring that the sacrifices of the soldiers who had fought and died there would never be forgotten. And though the ghosts of Hugh would no longer haunt the camp, their memory would live on, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and remembrance. The haunted barracks of Fort William. Fort William, nestled in the chilly, secluded mountains of Arizona, is an old military base with a history dating back to World War II. The fort has stood the test of time, with its worn brick walls and creaky wooden floors, bearing silent witness to decades of military operations and countless untold stories. Yet, not all the stories remain untold. Some have been whispered through generations, chilling the hearts of those who dare to listen. It was a cold autumn evening when Private James Walker first arrived at Fort William. The air was crisp, and the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parade ground. As a new recruit, James had heard the usual tales of haunted barracks and ghostly apparitions, but he shrugged them off as mere campfire stories. Little did he know, his skepticism would soon be tested. James was assigned to Barracks 13, a dilapidated building at the edge of the base. The barracks had been closed for years and was only recently reopened due to an influx of new recruits. The building had an eerie feel, with its broken windows patched up with plastic sheets and its doors creaking with the slightest breeze. As James entered, a chill ran down his spine, but he brushed it off, attributing it to the cold. His fellow soldiers, seasoned by a few more weeks at the fort, exchanged knowing glances as they saw James settle into his new quarters. "You know about Barracks 13, right?" One of them, Corporal Davis, asked with a smirk. Yeah, haunted barracks, ghosts of soldiers. I've heard it all," James replied dismissively. Davis's face grew serious. "Just be careful. Some of those stories are more than just rumors." That night, as James lay in his bunk, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The room was deathly quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves outside. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but an unexplained sense of dread kept him awake. Suddenly, he heard faint footsteps echoing in the hallway. He sat up, straining to listen, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. Convincing himself it was his imagination, he lay back down. The next few nights were uneventful, and James began to relax, thinking he'd gotten worked up over nothing. But on the fourth night, things took a sinister turn. He woke up to the sound of whispering. It was soft and indistinct, like a conversation just out of earshot. He looked around the room, but his bunkmates were sound asleep. He got up and followed the sound, which seemed to be coming from the far end of the hallway. As he approached, the whispers grew louder, but still unintelligible. He reached the end of the hall and found himself standing before a door that had been locked since the building's reopening. A cold draft seeped through the cracks in the doorframe, and James hesitated. Summoning his courage, he reached out and touched the doorknob. To his surprise, it turned easily in his hand. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, empty room. As he stepped inside, the temperature dropped noticeably, and his breath formed misty clouds in the air. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him, and the whispering stopped. The room was pitch black, save for a faint, ghostly glow emanating from the far corner. James's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly approached the light. As he drew closer, he saw the source, a figure in an old military uniform, its features obscured by shadows. The figure raised its head, revealing hollow, lifeless eyes that seemed to bore into James's soul. "Why have you come here?" the figure whispered, its voice echoing eerily in the small room. James tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure stepped closer, and James could feel an overwhelming sense of sorrow and anger emanating from it. "We were left behind," the ghostly figure continued, "forgotten, abandoned." Suddenly, the room was filled with the sounds of battle, gunfire, explosions, and the agonized screams of soldiers. James was engulfed in a vision of wartime horror, seeing flashes of young men fighting desperately, their faces twisted in fear and pain. He realized he was witnessing the final moments of the soldiers who had once occupied Barracks 13. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun, and James found himself back in the dark room, the ghostly figure now inches away from him. "Tell them our story," it whispered, its voice filled with a haunting sadness. "We deserve to be remembered." With that, the figure faded away, and the door to the room creaked open. James stumbled out, his heart racing and his mind reeling from what he had just experienced. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself. The next day, he shared his encounter with his fellow soldiers. At first, they were skeptical, but the sincerity and fear in his eyes convinced them otherwise. Word of James's experience spread throughout the base, and soon, the story of the forgotten soldiers of Barracks 13 became well known. A memorial was erected in their honor, and the barracks were permanently closed, left as a silent tribute to those who had perished there. James never forgot that night and the ghostly figure's plea. He carried their story with him, ensuring that the soldiers who were left behind were remembered, their sacrifices etched into the history of Fort William forever.
Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of darkness. If you enjoyed this tale, please like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more chilling stories of the unknown.